welcome again to Do You Know? I asked you in a previous episode what you knew about concentration camps in South Africa. And now we know that they were not the first and definitely also not the only concentration camps in the world. With me here again, the expert on concentration camps in South Africa, Professor Fransjohan Pretorius. Welcome.
So, thank you, Jolene. Thank you.
In our previous episode, you enlightened us about the establishment of concentration camps worldwide and briefly touched on the South African camps. But now I would like to ask you to give us more information. We know that there were separate concentration camps for white people and for black people. And in this episode, I would like you to shed light on the white camps. So when, why, and where were these camps established?
Right. The short answer to when, they started around about, the organization started in September 1900. But how did this develop that eventually by the end of 1900, there were 10, 15 camps, and by the end of 1901, about 40 camps. When Lord Roberts occupied Bloemfontein, the Free State capital, on the 13th of March 1900, he issued a proclamation 2 days later, very important, where he said that if Boers were to lay down their arms and sign the oath of neutrality, take note, not the oath of allegiance to the British Crown, but the oath of neutrality, and go back to their farms and not participate in the war any longer, he would protect them. That would be fine. And many Boers, because of the surrender of General Cronje with 4,000 men, took this opportunity to sign the oath of neutrality. They became what we called the hands-uppers, or the hands-uppers, the men who lay down their arms. They went back to their farms. And then Lord Roberts, from the May 1900, went up the railway line to Pretoria, occupied Pretoria, Transvaal, the South African Republic's capital, on the 5th of June 1900. Roberts thought the war was over. And as we always say, yes, the war was all over the country, because now the Boers started with a guerrilla warfare. And that meant that the commanders were sent to their local districts and were dispersed in smaller groups of even 6 men who had to provide for themselves in that district, which was much better than trying to feed a commando of 1,000 men. So when they were in their small little groups and the officers saw a British column approaching or an isolated convoy with provisions, they could gather these men within a few days by dispatch riders, get together. They would pounce on such a convoy or a column, capture a booty, clothes, ammunition, foodstuffs, and disperse again. And this was going to happen for the last 2 years of the war. What was terrible for poor Lord Roberts was that 2 days after his occupation of Pretoria, on the 7th of June 1900, General de Wet of the Free State attacked 3 British garrisons along the railway line north of Kroonstad, the major one being Roodeval, where the British provisions had piled up in Roberts' very quick march to Pretoria. And apart from all the loot, the booty that was captured there, Roberts was frustrated because in his hour of triumph in Pretoria, he was cut off from the world because the telegraph lines were also cut. And for a week, Roberts sat there cursing, and his wife and 2 daughters had to listen to him. Then, on the 16th of June, a very important date in the history of the war, he issued another proclamation. And he said, if an attack on the railway line occurs, the farmstead closest to that will be burned down. And he said to Lord Methven, I can think of nobody else's farmstead to start better than General de Wet's, which was close to Roodeval Station. Now, for the next 2-3 months, this happened, but the incidents on the attacks on the railway line didn't stop. So Robert said to himself, what now? And then on the 2nd of September 1900, he came with another proclamation, and this was a crucial one. He said, if there is an attack on the railway line, all farmsteads within a radius of 10 miles, 16 kilometers, were to be burned down or, demolished.
Yeah.
That is 550 square kilometers, as big as Pretoria, the Pretoria area, for one incident. And all livestock were to be killed or taken away, and all crops demolished, burnt. The scorched earth policy. And now Roberts discovered, because of this, because now the British officers were very adamant, now we're going to end this war. Now Roberts discovered two problems. The women and children whose homes had been burned down were ruthless. He was ruthless and they were ruthless. He had to do something about this because this wasn't good. They were still there to assist the Boers with supplies from somewhere. The other problem, what to do with the refugees, those who had laid down their arms and had gone to the farms, because the Boer officers were recommandeering them, remobilizing them to rejoin the commandos. So Roberts, because of his proclamation of 15 March, had to protect them. So he decided, let's put these people, these civilians, into what he called refugee camps. For the refugees, those hands-uppers and joiners, but they were in the minority, 30% as against 70% women and children and old men, and whose men were still, or fathers were still on commando or had been taken prisoner of war. So two groups immediately within a concentration camp. And well, the basic question is, where were these camps now? Where were these camps now established? Along the railway lines, because they were hauled from the farms, either on foot or on ox wagons, open ox wagons, and then by open train trucks to these newly established camps from September 1900, like Irene and others. By the end of the year, Potchefstroom and many others had been established by the end.
So,
yes, you asked me about numbers. Eventually, there were about 120, 115,000 white people in the camps, in these 40 camps. And there were so many of them, a superintendent would have 2,000 men in his camp and he couldn't cope because of the lack of food and the lack of medical officers and nurses. And all of a sudden, a train would stop with another 200 people taken from the farms. So eventually, these camps were twice as populated as they should have been, which is one of the problems, of course. You have people in these camps. They come from the farms where they're not immune to diseases. The doctors, who were half the number that they should have been, were not able to cope with the diseases like measles and typhoid fever and pneumonia, and you get people dying.
So in other words, in these camps, there were women, children, elder people, as well as the hands-uppers.
Yes. Eventually, there were 1,676 men who died white men who died in these camps. 1,422 of them were old men, but the other 225 or whatever, they were hands-uppers who died in these camps.
Sure. Just an interesting question that I didn't think of about before. The doctors that were in the camps, were they South Africans or were they from the British?
They were British doctors and South African from the various colonies, but many of them were very, very, very bad doctors. In fact, half of the 94, 47 of them were sacked, and of the nurses, the same kind of thing. So by the end of the war, they had to introduce nurses from New Zealand and Australia.
Oh my word. And I mean, I was just thinking also of the language problem. I mean, many of those people that work in the camps wouldn't be able to understand the doctors, and the doctors wouldn't be able to understand them. Is that was also
Yes,
obviously quite a bit of a thing.
that's a major issue.
Oh,
Yes.
okay. So just how many people actually died in these white camps?
We are not exactly sure. The official number calculated in 1913 by a South African civilian a civil servant was that there were 28,000 white people, of whom 22,000 were children under the age of 16. There are other figures as well, even up to 35,000. One would never know because some names are duplicated. And on the other hand, some families have got the same names. There are many Nicolaas Janssen van Rensburgs, for instance. So we don't know exactly, but let's say at least 28,000, which is a quarter of the inmates of the concentration camps and about 10% of the Boer population.
Sure. Oh, yeah. Anyway, so this makes me shudder, as I said before. So what many of us either don't know or maybe also choose to ignore is the fact that there were not only white people in the camps, and you alluded to that already in the previous episode, but these numbers of black concentration camps were, like I understood from you before, established for a different reason. But we will talk about that in the next episode of Do You Know? But this was the second episode of the series of 3 with the intent of showing some light or shedding some light on the concentration camps in South Africa. So join us again for the next episode where we will be discussing the black concentration camps. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.